They say the most dangerous secrets are not the ones whispered in the dark, but the ones written down in plain sight, camouflaged in ledgers, disguised as profit, buried under the weight of official signatures. Tonight, you're about to hear one of those secrets, a story that Southern aristocracy tried to erase, a story that, once spoken aloud, leaves a stain that can never be washed away. Imagine Alabama, 1840. The air heavy with humidity, cotton dust, and unspoken violence. A plantation owner, wealthy and feared, stood at the center of a scandal so grotesque that even the whispers of it carried danger. His wife, beautiful, cunning, and reckless, was accused of adultery. But instead of handling the matter with quiet shame, instead of covering it like most men of his class would, he orchestrated something far darker. Something meant not only to punish her, but to redefine power itself. On one brutal evening, he did what no one dared before. He handed her fate over to the very men society deemed less than human, his slaves. He gave them permission, publicly, to decide her punishment. Think about that for a moment. Imagine the sheer psychological weight of it. Men beaten, chained, broken by years of subjugation suddenly stood in a position of power over the wife of their master. For one night, the lines between victim and executioner blurred, and the South trembled with the unspoken consequences. But this wasn't a story of justice. It wasn't freedom. It wasn't rebellion. It was theater. Carefully staged humiliation meant to send a message to everyone watching, to the slaves, that their anger could be turned into a weapon against each other, against any who broke the order of the house, to the wife, that her betrayal had stripped her of even the illusion of dignity, and to the community, that Moss Creek, or any plantation like it, was not merely a site of labor, but a crucible of control, where fear was currency and human beings were tools in a system designed to rot the soul. And yet, there are things even darker buried within this story. Because records suggest that the plantation owner's decision wasn't a moment of madness. It was calculated. He knew the weight of shame. He knew the psychological scars would last longer than any lash of the whip. By weaponizing his slaves' rage, by forcing them into complicity, he corrupted them as much as he punished her. It was a ritual of domination that went beyond flesh and into the very essence of identity. But here's the part that chills me most. There are fragments of ledgers, scattered testimonies, and coded journals from this period that suggest this event wasn't isolated. It wasn't a single night of madness. It was part of something far larger, something orchestrated, hidden, repeated in silence across other plantations in the Deep South. And this begs the question, if history has hidden this from you, what else lies buried in the archives, written in plain ink but never taught, never spoken aloud? Before I pull you deeper into this descent, let me ask you something, because it matters. Where are you right now? What city, what state, and what time is it where you are as you listen to this? Because time is a strange thing when we talk about history. It collapses, the past bleeds into the present, and what you're about to hear may hit closer to home than you ever expected. The night it happened, the plantation grounds were alive with an unnatural silence. Even the cicadas, those eternal singers of the southern dusk, seemed to hush as if nature itself recoiled from what was about to unfold. Lanterns lined the yard in front of the main house, casting long shadows across the red clay earth. Every slave on the property was ordered to gather, men, women, children, all of them forced to bear witness. Punishment was not simply about correction, it was about spectacle. The wife stood in the center, bound, trembling, her once proud posture reduced to something frail. She had been dressed in rags, her hair pulled and tangled, her face streaked with both defiance and fear. The overseer barked commands, his voice sharp like iron. Around her stood the chosen men, the slaves her husband had selected to deliver the punishment. They were strong, men whose backs carried the scars of whips, whose muscles bore years of toil. They had been summoned not as servants, but as instruments. Imagine what it felt like in their chests that night. Rage like a fire, coiled tight and burning for years, now given permission to rise. But that permission came at a price. They knew the truth. This wasn't freedom. This was a trap. To strike her was to risk their souls, to feed the very system that enslaved them. To hold back was to defy the master's command, a defiance punishable by death. No matter what they did, the chains tightened. The husband watched from the porch, a glass of bourbon in his hand, calm, almost pleased. His eyes carried no love, no grief, no shame. To him, this was order, discipline. A man staking his claim not just over his wife, not just over his property, but over reality itself. He was saying to everyone gathered, I control who suffers, I control who strikes, I even control who gets to feel hate. The first blow fell, a sound sharp as thunder in Tia's. He humid night, she gasped, staggered, and the crowd stirred. Some slaves looked away, ashamed. Others couldn't help but watch, their emotions torn between satisfaction and horror. Each lash, each strike, was both an act of punishment and an act of corruption. He had turned them into participants in their own degradation. By the end, she was collapsed in the dirt, her body broken, her spirit shattered. But the true wound wasn't hers alone. The slaves who had lifted their hands walked away with something heavy inside them. The master had won twice. He had punished his wife, and he had poisoned the very men who might one day rise against him. And here's the truth. History doesn't want you to ask, was this a singular act of cruelty, or was it ritualized? Was it one man's madness, or a pattern, repeated in shadows, unrecorded, except in fragments of private journals and cryptic ledgers scattered across the South? Because here's what the surviving scraps of evidence whisper: the event was written down, not just as punishment, but as a lesson. As if it were a formula, a method, a way to bind both slave and master tighter in a cycle of power, shame, and complicity. And the deeper you dig into the records of the 1840s, the more you see traces of similar events, hidden under words like discipline, correction, penance. The South wasn't just built on forced labor, it was built on rituals of control. Rituals meant to twist the human spirit into knots so tight they could never be untangled. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself this. If such things were happening in plain sight, under the gaze of neighbors, overseers, and community leaders, how much darker were the things that never left the locked rooms, the hidden ledgers, the secrets burned before death? What most people don't realize is that the South was not merely a system of chains and cotton, it was a laboratory, a place where human behavior was studied, twisted, and weaponized. Plantation owners weren't just men of wealth, many were men of calculation. They knew how to break a body, but far more dangerously, they knew how to fracture a soul. The Moss Creek records suggest that after the wife's punishment, something changed on the plantation. Work resumed as if nothing had happened, but the atmosphere grew heavier, more charged. The slaves who had struck her now carried an invisible mark. The others looked at them differently, not as brothers in chains, but as men tainted by their master's cruelty. Division had been seeded, distrust grew, and in slavery, distrust was the ultimate weapon. The wife herself became a ghost of what she once was. Broken, silent, avoided even by those who once served her. Her husband had not only disgraced her but had effectively erased her authority within the household. But what's chilling is that he didn't discard her. No, he kept her there, kept her as a living warning, a reminder of what happened when you strayed from his command. Her presence, her silence, became another instrument of fear. And this is where the pattern emerges. The South wasn't just obsessed with punishment, it was obsessed with theater. Every lash, every hanging, every public humiliation was staged. It wasn't enough to correct, they had to display. They had to make an example that reached beyond the flesh into the minds of every witness. The plantation yard was a stage, and every act of cruelty was a script written to condition obedience. But here's the piece you weren't meant to know. Fragments of correspondence between certain plantation families reveal that they exchanged these methods. Techniques of psychological control, documented like recipes. One Lee Teta from 1842 mentions the utility of fear made visible. Another speaks of the binding of slaves not only to labor but to their guilt. These weren't random acts of sadism. They were calculated, shared, perfected. So ask yourself, what happens when entire communities are built on rituals of fear and shame? What does it do to the men who enforce it? To the women forced to live in its shadows? To the children who grow up watching it, absorbing it like the humid southern air? Violence becomes normal, deception becomes tradition, control becomes the invisible religion that everyone worships, whether they want to or not. And maybe that's the real corruption, because long after chains were broken, long after plantations rotted back into the soil, those methods of control didn't vanish. They transformed, they adapted, they slipped into institutions, into politics, into the very veins of American culture. What was once done with whips and ledgers is now done with screens and contracts, but the architecture is the same: divide, shame, display, control. If you listen closely, you can still hear its echo. In the way media parades humiliation, in the way institutions pit people against each other, in the way power convinces the powerless to carry out its will while believing it's their choice. And now I ask you, do you think this story is about 1840, or do you think it's still happening now, right in front of you, hidden in plain sight? The deeper you descend into this story, the more you begin to realize that what happened in Alabama in 1840 wasn't just punishment, it was ritual. A ritual meant to transform witnesses into participants, participants into conspirators, and conspirators into prisoners of their own silence. The plantation owner understood something that many tyrants across history have known. If you want to control people forever, don't just chain their bodies, make them complicit in the crime. The men who struck his wife that night carried a scar that no overseer's whip could match. They had crossed a forbidden line. They had tasted the master's power, but in doing so, they had confirmed his dominance. Because now, every time they looked at themselves, they saw not just a slave, but a tool of his will. And that was the brilliance of it. Their rage had been turned against them. He had shackled their spirits with guilt. But this pattern is older than Alabama, older than the South. You can trace it back through time. Ancient empires that forced conquered soldiers to slaughter their own families, cults that demanded acts of betrayal as proof of loyalty, secret orders that required oaths sealed in blood. The formula never changes: corruption through participation. Once you're complicit, once you've taken part, you no longer stand outside the system, you are the system. Now consider this. What if the plantations were not just centers of agriculture, but training grounds? Laboratories of psychological warfare where methods were tested, refined, and perfected before being unleashed on a larger scale. Look at history. The overseer's lash becomes the military drill sergeant's shout. The plantation ledger becomes the bureaucrat's file. The ritualized punishment becomes the public trial, the televised humiliation, the digital shaming. Do you see it now? The plantation wasn't just about cotton, it was about control. Control so sophisticated that it outlived the very soil it was born from. And this is why the story of the adulterous wife matters. Because her punishment wasn't simply a personal vendetta, it was theater designed to condition everyone watching. The slaves learned fear, the wife learned submission. The neighbors, if they heard whispers, learned what power looked like when it was stripped of mercy. Even the children, too young to understand, learned that survival meant silence. And here's where it gets dangerous. Halfway through this journey, I want you to do something, not just for the algorithm, not just for me, but for yourself. If you've followed me this far, if you feel the weight of what's being revealed, I want you to comment this phrase twice below. The chains are not broken, they are transformed. Do it not just as words, but as a signal, a marker that you are awake, that you've crossed into seeing what others refuse to see. Because the transformation of chains is the secret of history. They never vanish, they evolve. The question is, can you see them in your own life, in your job, in your news, in your culture? Who is holding the whip now? Who is forcing you to play the role of your own oppressor? Think carefully, because once you see it, once you feel it in your bones, there's no turning back. After that night, whispers spread across the county. Neighbors didn't speak of it openly, but the South was a land where silence was currency. People saw the bruises on the wife when she occasionally appeared in town. They noticed her silence, her downcast eyes, her absence from church. They noticed that her husband's reputation did not suffer. In fact, it seemed to grow. Men who had once doubted his authority now deferred to him. He had crossed a line none of them dared to cross, and in doing so, he became something more than a man. He became a symbol. Symbols are dangerous, because they aren't bound to flesh and blood, they linger. And what he created that night was a symbol of power without limits. A symbol that said, I decide who is guilty, I decide who is punished, and I decide who carries the shame. That symbol seeped into the soil, into the minds of everyone who witnessed it. Even decades later, fragments of diaries and oral histories suggest that Moss Creek was whispered about like a cursed ground, a place where something unholy had been set in motion. But this wasn't about one plantation or one man's cruelty. What happened there was a mirror of a much deeper system. Every empire in history has relied on symbols of power to condition obedience. Rome crucified rebels on public roads, leaving their bodies to rot as warnings. The Spanish Inquisition paraded the accused through the streets before burning them alive. Totalitarian regimes of the 20th century staged public trials where the accused confessed crimes they never committed. It's the same script, rewritten across centuries. Make the punishment visible, unforgettable, undeniable. The plantation owner in Alabama may not have known he was repeating an ancient formula, but he embodied it perfectly. He understood that control is not secured by strength alone, it is secured by spectacle, and that's why his wise Fee's suffering was staged before the eyes of slaves and neighbors alike. It wasn't just vengeance, it was a lesson, a reminder that his power extended beyond laws, beyond morality, beyond God himself. And here's the part that cuts the deepest. Once you understand this formula, you begin to see it everywhere. Think about how modern systems display power. Think about how humiliation has become entertainment, how destruction of reputation has replaced the gallows, how trials by fire are now trials by media. The execution ground has become the digital screen, but the psychology is the same. A punishment witnessed by thousands, millions even, does not just destroy the guilty, it conditions the watchers. It teaches you what not to say, who not to offend, which boundaries you must never cross. This is why the story of Moss Creek matters. It is not just history, it is a map, a blueprint of how power feeds on shame, how cruelty becomes ritual, how silence becomes survival. And when you realize this, when you recognize the pattern, you must ask yourself, how many of the things you believe today, the limits you accept, the fears you carry, were planted inside you by a system that doesn't need chains anymore? Because here's the forbidden truth. Chains made of iron can be broken, but chains made of belief, shame and complicity, those can last forever. What happened after the wife's punishment is even more disturbing than the act itself, because the plantation did not fall into chaos, it became more orderly. Productivity increased. Records show Moss Creek's profits rose sharply in the months that followed, and this is the darkest truth of all. Cruelty often strengthens a system, not weakens it. Fear is efficient, guilt is profitable, silence is golden. The slaves worked harder, but not out of loyalty. They worked because now they carried something heavier than chains. They carried the knowledge that they were capable of destroying one of their own captors, and yet still remained slaves. That paradox ate at them. To strike her was to taste vengeance, but to realize it changed nothing was to swallow despair. The master had engineered a cycle where their own anger became fuel for his control. The wife herself became a living relic. She walked the halls of the house like a shadow, avoided by everyone, her humiliation never allowed to fade. Her punishment did not end that night, it became her identity. And in this way, her husband ensured she was more valuable broken than whole. She was a reminder, a symbol, a daily spectacle of what happened when anyone defied the order of his world. But listen closely, because here is where the history books grow silent. Some fragments suggest that Eleanor Creswell, the widow who later took control of Moss Creek, studied these methods, that she took notes, that she refined them. If that is true, then the punishment of the adulterous wife was not an isolated act of vengeance, but a prototype, a ritualized formula that Eleanor transformed into a system. And this is the abyss. Moss Creek wasn't just a plantation, it was a stage, an experiment, a proving ground for the kind of control that thrives even when the chains are gone. Control that passes from generation to generation, slipping through. From overseers to employers, from masters to politicians, from plantations to institutions. You think you're free because you don't see the lash, because you don't feel the weight of iron around your wrists. But tell me, do you not feel the pressure to conform? Do you not feel the invisible eyes watching what you say, what you post, what you believe? Do you not feel the weight of fear when you consider speaking out, the way silence feels safer than truth? That is Moss Creek living inside you. That is the ritual continuing, not in Alabama, not in 1840, but here and now. And maybe that's the true horror of this story. The plantation is gone, the house rotted long ago, the fields have swallowed the bones, but the formula survived, the lesson was absorbed, transmitted and replicated. What began with chains and whips has become law, media, finance, culture. The methods evolve, but the outcome remains the same. Obedience through fear, silence through shame, power through spectacle. So the question is, when you look at your own life, at your own choices, at the things you don't say because you know the consequences, do you see the plantation still standing? By the late 1840s, Moss Creek was whispered about in hushed tones among neighboring estates. They didn't speak of cotton yields or profits alone, they spoke of Eleanor, The widow who had inherited a modest farm and turned it into a machine of discipline so precise that men twice her size lowered their eyes when she walked past. But the secret of her success was not soil, nor slaves, nor markets. It was something more insidious. She had mastered the art of psychological bondage. The plantation ledger, her coded records, show a chilling pattern. She didn't just sell young men for profit, she staged their initiation into despair before sending them west. The humiliation of the wife had been a prototype, and Eleanor perfected it. Before a man was ever placed on an auction block, she ensured he carried scars you could not see. Her methods broke him not with whips, but with rituals that erased the fire in his eyes. When buyers remarked at how compliant her men were, they had no idea they were paying a premium for spirits that had already been bent. Do you understand what that means? She had turned trauma into currency, despair into profit. She discovered what regimes and corporations across time would later refine, that a broken will is more valuable than a broken body. And here's where the rabbit hole deepens. Because Eleanor wasn't alone. Letters between certain estates hint at meetings, gatherings where planters and their wives exchanged more than gossip. They shared techniques, methods, a private language of control. What we think of as isolated cruelty may have been the early blueprint of an institutional system of manipulation, a system that long outlived the plantations. Now pause and let that sink in. How many of the systems you live under today were birthed in that same soil? Schools that teach obedience before knowledge, workplaces that reward silence over truth. Media that parades humiliation as entertainment. Do you really think these are accidents, or are they echoes, modern forms of the same formula tested in places like Moss Creek? The enslaved men and women were not just workers, they were unwilling subjects in an experiment of power. Their pain was studied, their reactions measured, their spirits shaped into models of control, and when slavery ended, those methods didn't vanish. They were absorbed, refined, and unleashed on the wider world. That is the forbidden history. The plantation was not just an economic engine, it was a laboratory, a crucible, a training ground for systems of domination that still shape the world you live in. So now I ask you, how many of the choices you think are yours were planted in you long before you were born? How many of your fears are inherited, passed down from generations of conditioning? And more importantly, what would happen if you dared to break them? Because once you see the formula, once you understand that the chains were never destroyed, only transformed, you begin to feel something dangerous rising inside you, a recognition, an awakening, a refusal to play the role written for you. But that recognition comes at a cost. Once you see the pattern, you can never unsee it. By 1850, the cracks in the South were beginning to show. Whispers of abolition, uprisings and resistance moved like fire through the plantations. But Moss Creek did not tremble, it thrived. And the reason, hidden in Eleanor's coded ledgers, reveals why her methods were so feared. She didn't rule through brute force alone, she ruled through identity. Understand this. When a man knows he is enslaved, he carries rebellion in his heart. But when you make him believe that his own rage, his own shame, his own silence are part of who he is, then you no longer need chains. His very sense of self becomes the prison. That was Eleanor's genius, and it's the same genius behind every enduring system of control. She created rituals designed to strip men of their former identities and replace them with something hollow. They would enter her plantation as men, strong and defiant, but leave as property, shaped, molded, compliant, not because they were beaten into submission, but because they had been forced to participate in their own undoing. And that's the truth the South never wrote down. Slavery was never just physical, it was spiritual, psychological, generational. And ask yourself, doesn't that sound familiar? Look at your world now. You are told who you are by your papers, your profiles, your job titles, your debts. You are measured not in strength or honor, but in compliance and productivity. The same system that once used chains and ledgers now uses algorithms and contracts. Different tools, same prison. That's why stories like this are buried, because if you truly understood the plantation not as a relic of the past, but as a living template of control, you would see the chains around you today. Chains that smile at you, chains that offer you convenience, comfort, security, but chains nonetheless. And this is why I told you earlier to leave that phrase in the comments. The chains are not broken, they are transformed. Because once you name it, once you acknowledge it, you weaken its grip. You step outside the role written for you. You begin to awaken, but awakening comes with a price. Just as those men at Moss Creek carried guilt for the rest of their lives, so too will you carry the burden of knowledge. Once you see the plantation inside the institutions around you, you will never look at your world the same way again. That's the descent we are on now, not just into history, but into recognition. The South buried its secrets in ledgers, in diaries, in stories erased from schoolbooks, but those secrets live on, encoded in systems so familiar you mistake them for life itself. The real question is, once you see the truth, what will you do with it? Will you look away, as so many did at Moss Creek, or will you confront it, even if it costs you the comfort of ignorance? Because the story isn't finished, and neither is your role in it. There is one detail buried in the fragments of Moss Creek that chills me more than any lash, any ledger, any whispered testimony. It is said that before Eleanor sold a man westward, she forced him to speak words that were not his own. A ritual of confession, hollow and coerced, where the enslaved man declared himself unworthy of freedom, unworthy of rebellion, unworthy of defiance. Whether these confessions were written or spoken aloud, no one knows for certain, but the implication is clear. She was not content to own their bodies. She wanted their voices, their tongues, their very sense of truth. Think about that, because when you force a man to repeat the lie long enough, he begins to carry it as his own, and when enough men repeat it, when it echoes from shack to shack, generation to generation, the lie becomes culture, and culture is the heaviest chain of all. Now ask yourself, how much of the world you live in is built on coerced confessions? How much of what you believe is yours was whispered into your mind by repetition, by spectacle, by fear of standing apart? You say the words, you live the script, and you forget who wrote it for you. That is Moss Creek, alive and well, moving through centuries, binding men who think themselves free. The wife's punishment was not just cruelty, it was a symbol of erasure. She was stripped of identity, her shame broadcast to all, her silence weaponized, and when the slaves struck her, when they became the instruments of her humiliation, they too were erased. Their rage no longer theirs, their hands no longer theirs. They belonged to the system, even in the moment they thought they had power. That is the brilliance of corruption. It convinces you that your own choices are your own, when in truth, they are written by another's hand. And isn't that exactly what you see today? Look at the cycles of outrage, of distraction, of endless division. You think you're choosing a side, but the sides were built for you. You think your voice is yours, but every word has been pulled from a script designed to keep you fighting shadows while the system feeds. Eleanor's plantation may be gone, but her ritual remains, refined, disguised, and multiplied 1,000-fold. The forbidden truth is this: the plantation was not destroyed by war. It metastasized. Its architecture of control seeped into law, into religion, into media, into culture. And if you dare to see it, if you dare to strip the disguise away, you realize you've been living in Moss Creek your entire life. But here's the most dangerous question of all. If you have been living inside Moss Creek without knowing it, then who is the master now? The final truth about Moss Creek is the one no historian will ever admit openly, because it doesn't belong to the past. It belongs to the present. The plantation was not an anomaly. It was a design, a prototype of control so perfect it could survive the collapse of slavery, survive the burning of ledgers, survive the death of every witness. The true inheritance of Moss Creek was not land or cotton. It was the formula. Divide the powerless against each other, stage punishment as spectacle, turn rage into guilt, bind silence into culture, and above all, ensure that the victim becomes complicit so he can never again see himself as free. That is the formula, and when you strip away the cotton fields, when you silence the cicadas, when you bury the bones beneath centuries of soil, you can still see it, alive. Not in chains of iron, but in contracts, policies, screens, and illusions. The same system that forced slaves to strike their master's wife now convinces men to strike each other online, in politics, in neighborhoods, in families, believing it's their choice, never realizing they are still on the stage, still playing their assigned role. And this is the horror no one dares to speak. The plantation owner won. Not because his land thrived, not because his slaves obeyed, not because his wife was broken, but because the ritual survived. It survived war, it survived abolition, it survived history itself. It crawled forward invisible, reshaped until it became the very air you breathe. Now you have heard the story that was never meant to be told. You have seen how the plantation was not only a place of labor but a crucible of control, and you have felt, deep in your chest, the echo of that control still alive around you. So the question becomes, what do you do now? Do you stay silent, as the neighbors did, pretending you did not see? Do you play your role, as the slaves wow? Are forced to, believing you have no choice? Or do you break the ritual, even if breaking it means walking into the unknown, stripped of the comfort of ignorance? Remember the phrase, whisper it again. The chains are not broken, they are transformed. That is the key. The recognition, the awakening. Because the moment you see the chains, the moment you name them, the moment you refuse to carry them, something shifts, and that shift cannot be undone. This story began in Alabama, 1840, with a woman dragged into the dirt and humiliated before all. But it does not end there. It ends with you, right now, in this moment. The descent is complete. You have walked through forbidden history, through hidden agendas, through rituals of control designed to bind men for generations, and now you stand at the edge of a choice, to live asleep inside the plantation, or to awaken and finally walk beyond its gates. What will you do?